The 7 so-called Teal independents elected to office last federal election were swept in with the support of historically Labor or Green voters. The near-record support for independents did not come mainly from disaffected Liberal voters. That's according to a study by the ANU. It found 31% of people who voted for Teal independents in May had supported Labor in 2019. In comparison, 18% supported the coalition that year.
The idea this was the Libs falling apart in those districts is, I think, an overstatement. Far and away, the biggest driver of first preference vote for Teal candidates were Labor and Green voters finding a candidate to back if the goal was to remove a Liberal incumbent.
Of the 7 Teal independents elected at the last election, 6 won seats previously held by Liberals. ANU's study also found the Liberal Party's election loss was a combination of the economy, the pandemic, and Scott Morrison. For more on this, let's bring in Sarah Cameron from Griffith University, one of the lead researchers on the project. Sarah, thanks for your time. Let's start, first of all, with the reason why the Teals did so well. Is it the shift in the impact of the generational vote, like the millennials having now I think a comparable level of support in the electorate to what the boomers have?
So really what we see with the success of the independents in the 2022 election is related to conditions in the electorate that have been brewing for some time. In particular, we have seen growing disenchantment with the major political parties. Political partisanship has reached record lows. The electorate has become more volatile over time, with just 37% of voters consistently voting the same way in election, which is the lowest it has ever been. So these conditions have been there for a while, but what was unique in the 2022 election was that there was, in many seats at least, a well-funded, well-organised independence movement to provide a viable alternative for these disenchanted voters to get behind.
So disenchanted voters, but also you would think some calculated decisions as well from, say, voters in Kooyong or Curtin, where they would normally vote for Labor, but they think, well, no, this time that Kate Chaney or Monique Ryan are a better chance, so they voted for the independent.
Yes, that's right. We see a lot of tactical voting. So less than 1 in 5 of those who voted for a Teal in 2022 voted for the coalition in 2019. So this narrative that Teal voters are disenchanted Liberal voters isn't entirely supported, as the majority of their support came from strategic Labor and Greens voters casting their ballots for the candidate that they thought had the best chance of winning.
The interesting scenario is, while it might be 18% on average, even in some of those seats, if the Liberal loses a couple of percent, it can be devastating in a marginal seat.
Absolutely. These are tight contests, and so even just a small number of voters shifting from the coalition to another party or an independent can make a big difference to the result.
The gender flip from women voting for the coalition to now increasingly voting for Labor, what do you put that down to? Because there has been a trend in that regard.
Yes, there has been a shift. So back in the 1990s, women were slightly more likely to vote for the coalition in comparison to men. Over time, this has reversed and the gender gap in voting has widened. So now there's a lot fewer women who vote for the coalition in comparison to men. Now, the reasons for this, it comes down to partly changes in the electorate. Since the 1990s, we've of course seen huge social change. Women's increased participation in higher education and in the labour force. But we've also seen big changes in the political parties over this time. Back in the 1990s, women were similarly underrepresented in both the Liberal and Labor parties. And since that time, Labor has dramatically increased their representation of women in Parliament, while progress has been much more gradual within the coalition.
So we've got some concerns there on the coalition side. Labor's got some issues as well, though, with a very low, still by historical standards, a low primary. Can they continue to hold on to majority government with relying on such a low primary and decreasing?
So this is a really interesting factor of the 2022 election. There was actually a swing against Labor from the 2019 election that they lost. So I think it's really fair to describe the 2022 election result as more of a loss for the coalition than as a win for Labor. And so essentially, in our political system, if people are disenchanted with both the major political parties, we're still going to see one of them emerge as winner based on the preference between the two.
And so with Labor, though, it's got its own challenges, but obviously, with those generational shifts in terms of influence on outcomes, the Greens are increasingly a challenge for Labor, as we saw just recently in the Victorian election.
Yes, the Greens are a challenge for Labor. I think some of the major issues emerging, though, around gender and around generation are a bigger problem for the coalition than for Labor. And that's because of this generational change element. So younger generations are further to the left than previous generations. And as these younger generations, including millennials, get older, they make up a greater proportion of the electorate. And what our data shows is that millennials aren't shifting to the right as they get older. If anything, they're shifting to the left. So this presents a major problem for the coalition, as does the real decline they've seen in support from women. And they're in a diminished capacity to address that, as they have fewer women representatives following the 2022 election result.
The top three reasons the coalition lost, there were a couple, the unpopularity of Scott Morrison, pandemic experience, people wanting to move on. I was surprised by the third one that you found, that the perception the economy was performing not as well as people would have hoped. Talk us through what you picked up there.
Yeah, so what we found is that 2/3 of voters thought that the economy had become worse over the year leading up to the election. And that was the most pessimistic view of the economy in over 30 years, since 1990. And what we tend to see is that when voters are dissatisfied with the performance of the economy, they are more likely to vote the government out. In particular, this was related to the cost of living crisis. Normally, the coalition is seen as the preferred party on all economic issues, but in this election, voters were concerned about the coalition's ability to handle the cost of living crisis.
Sarah Cameron from the Australian Election Study. Fascinating reading. I appreciate your insights. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time.